The prairie of Nebraska was a thing of damp chill and muted colors, a land that promised only what it had already given: hard soil, gray skies, and a future as flat as the horizon. Clara Mallory knew its every mood, its every demand. At 24, she was a farmer's daughter, her hands practical, her mind shaped by the realities of drought and early frost. Her worth was measured in bushels of wheat and the neatness of her stitches. And in this, she was always found sufficient, but never exceptional. That place was reserved for Evelyn. Evelyn, her younger sister, was a creature of light and laughter, her hands soft, her beauty a currency the family had come to rely on. Clara had always stood behind her, in the shadow of that effortless shine. Hearing the whispers, "Clara is the capable one, but Evelyn is the prize." The letters had begun arriving in the spring, after a winter that had taken half their livestock and left their father's face a mask of quiet desperation. They were not for Evelyn. They were for Clara. "He is a man of property. Clara," her father had said, not meeting her eyes. He held the letter, his thumb tracing the unfamiliar stamp of the New Mexico territory. "A mercantile owner, Samuel Briggs. He seeks a wife of good standing and practical skills." Her mother, her hands twisting in her apron, had only said, "He writes a fine hand, a very fine hand." It was a bargain, a mail-order arrangement to save the farm. Clara, the practical one, was the payment. Evelyn had wept, but Clara noted she wept for the drama of it, not the substance. Clara herself did not weep. She packed the few dresses she owned, her mother's sewing kit, and a stubborn sense of duty that felt more like a stone in her gut than a virtue. The journey was a long, bruising rattle that shook the gray Nebraska mud from her bones and replaced it with a fine, penetrating dust. The world outside the coach window changed with a violence that startled her. The green faded. The soil turned a hard, angry red, as if the land itself were bleeding. Mountains, sharp and barren, clawed at a sky so vast and blue it felt like a judgment. They were in the Arizona territory now, a place that existed on maps as a vague square, but felt in reality like the surface of a forge. The stagecoach limped into the Red Butte station, a raw settlement that seemed to have been thrown at the landscape and had only partially stuck. It was a place of wind and beginnings, a half-built railroad depot, a post office, a combination saloon and market whose false front promised a civilization the rest of the street denied, and a smithy. The wind was the only constant. It howled, carrying the red dust into everything, coating Clara's tongue, stinging her eyes. A windmill shrieked a single, maddening note, over and over. As the coach door opened, the heat struck her like a physical blow. With it came the smells of the station, the sharp tang of hot metal from the forge, the acrid bite of coffee boiled too long, and a thin, reedy waltz tune drifting from the saloon. Clara stepped down, her black traveling skirt instantly filmed with ochre. She was tired, sore, and profoundly alone. The few people milling about a pair of dusty prospectors. A woman in faded calico barely gave her a glance. New arrivals were common, survivors were not. Two men leaned against the side of the post office, their voices low but carrying on the dry wind. "Heard the Rattlesnake Gang hit the noon stage," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco. "That weren't just the gang," the other replied, his voice lower. "That was railroad business. They say Miles Thorne is on their payroll now." "Thorne, sweet heavens. What for?" "Water, same as always. They mean to push everyone off the Coyote Spring, the Dine, the settlers, everyone. The railroad wants that water, and they'll get it." Clara pretended not to listen. Pulling her valise close, she clutched the letters from Mr. Samuel Briggs. There were 3 of them, tied with a ribbon. She had read them until the creases were soft as cloth. They were filled with flowery words, promises of a gentle life and a home graced by civilized comforts. He wrote of gardens and church socials. She looked around at the raw, sun-baked lumber, the hard faces of the men, the endless, threatening expanse of red rock. The words in the letters felt suddenly terribly false. They were sugar-coated, hollow. The penmanship was elegant, but the ink seemed to slide off the reality of this place. A suspicion, cold and sharp, pierced her fatigue. The man who wrote these letters did not live here, not in this place of dust and whispered violence. Her eyes drifted to the smithy. It was an open-air structure, little more than a roof of ocotillo branches offering a lattice of shade. A man was working at the anvil, his back to her. He was shoeing a tall bay horse, and his movements were a revelation. Where the rest of the town felt frantic or broken, he was a point of stillness. He was all quiet, contained strength. Every lift of the hammer, every touch to the horse's hoof was precise, measured, and final. He wasted no motion. He was a native man, a Dine. She supposed from the dark, smooth line of his jaw and the simple silver disc that held his long hair tied back. He wore a plain cotton shirt, the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. He was a scout, perhaps, or a liaison. The outline had said some worked as go-betweens, bridging the gap between the native communities and the encroaching world of the railroad and the army. This man was a smith, his trade written in the soot on his hands and the rhythmic percussion of his work. He finished with the hoof and spoke a low word to the horse, a sound so quiet Clara could not hear it, but the animal seemed to understand, shifting its weight in response. He laid the hammer on the anvil, the ringing silence that followed seeming louder than the noise had been. Then he turned. He was perhaps 30 years old, his face a map of plains and lines that spoke of sun and wind, not of softness. He was not handsome in the way of the men back east, or even in the slick, polished way her sister's suitors had been. He was something else. His stillness was a presence, his discipline a tangible force. He was a man of profound honor, she thought, though she could not have said why. It was in his bearing, in the calm, steady set of his mouth. He looked across the station yard, his gaze sweeping past the other passengers, past the freight wagons, and then his eyes found hers. It was not a long look. It lasted no more than the time it takes to draw a breath. But it was deep. His eyes, dark and intelligent, did not assess her as a woman, or as a settler, or as a threat. He simply saw her. He saw the dust, the fear, the exhaustion, and the steel spine holding her upright. He saw a person standing on the edge of a world she did not understand. And in that same brief moment, Clara saw him. She saw the man behind the forge, the scout who knew the land, the quiet authority that needed no words. He was as real as the red stone beneath her feet, as real as the heat and the wind. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, not of welcome, but of acknowledgement. Then he turned back to his work, picked up a rasp, and drew it across the hoof, the sharp, scraping sound cutting through the air. Clara let out the breath she had been holding. The world tilted. The letters in her hand suddenly felt like a child's toy, a fantasy. The sweet-talking Mr. Briggs, the rattlesnake gang, the fight for water, and this silent, disciplined Dine Smith. One of these things was real. The others were just noise, just wind. She clutched her valise and took her first full step onto the red soil of the Arizona Territory. No longer a farmer's daughter. No longer just the sister standing in the shadow. She was Clara Mallory, 24 years old, and she had arrived. The brief respite at Red Butte Station ended as abruptly as it had begun. The station master, a man whose face was a permanent squint against the sun, called for the westward-bound passengers. The horses had been changed, their sides still slick with water, their breath pluming in the hot, dry air. Clara Mallory, her resolve hardened by that brief silent exchange at the smithy, picked up her valise. The letters from Mr. Briggs felt heavy in her pocket. No longer promises, but a summons. She was still a farmer's daughter, and the farm was failing. She was still the practical one, and this was the bargain she had made. To keep the family honor, to settle her father's unvoiced debts. She would see this through. She boarded the coach, her back straight, and settled herself by the window, the red dust already finding its way through the leather curtains. The coach, a heavy Concord, lurched into motion. The new destination, the town where Mr. Briggs and his mercantile supposedly waited, was another 2 days' ride through yet more territory that felt less like a home and more like a test. She was not alone. The compartment held a miniature and uncomfortable society. Opposite her sat a minister, a pale man with a soft chin, who seemed to be sweating out his faith into the frayed collar of his black coat. He clutched a Bible, his thumb marking a passage in Leviticus, and his lips moved in silent, constant reprimand. Next to him sat a widow, Mrs. Gable, a woman not so much grieving as encased in black bombazine that rustled with every jolt. She was older, her face lined like a dry creek bed, and she watched the world outside with a sharp, assessing gaze that suggested she had buried more than just a husband in this land. The man beside Clara, uncomfortably close, was a liquor salesman. He introduced himself as Mr. Finney, a purveyor of bottled courage and liquid sunshine. He smelled of sour mash and cheap cologne, and his valise clinked softly when he moved. He kept offering Clara a small, restorative sample from a silver flask, which she pointedly refused. "You are headed for Red Butte, miss," he had asked, his voice oily. The name of her destination was on her luggage tag. "That is correct," Clara said, her voice clipped. "A fine town, a boom town, you might say." "Mr. Finney pressed. "Plenty of opportunity, though, I must say, it is a hard place for a lady alone." His eyes lingered on her. "She is not alone, sir," the minister interjected, looking up from his Bible. "She has the protection of the Lord, and the protection of this coach, such as it is." "Mrs. Gable added, her voice dry as gravel. "Which is to say, we are all just cargo, Reverend, and the Lord seems mighty preoccupied elsewhere." The minister flinched, and Mr. Finney chuckled. Clara turned back to the window. For hours, the world was nothing but red rock and yellow sky. The coach climbed, the air growing thinner, the landscape more broken. They entered a canyon, the walls rising up on either side, steep and claustrophobic. The late afternoon sun cast one side in brilliant, sharp relief and plunged the other into a deep, purple shadow. The road narrowed, twisting between massive boulders. The rhythmic clopping of the 6-horse team and the squeal of the axles were the only sounds. Then they were not. A single shot cracked the air, echoing, multiplying, until it sounded like a dozen rifles. The sound was instantly followed by the driver's roar, a high-pitched scream from one of the horses, and the violent lurch of the coach as the brakes were thrown. "In the name of God," the minister shouted, dropping his Bible. Mr. Finney, his face suddenly the color of lard, dove for the floor, pulling his sample case over his head. The coach door was torn open. A man stood there, his face masked by a filthy red bandana. He held a Colt revolver, and it was aimed at the minister's soft belly. "Get out," the man growled. "All of you, now." They tumbled out into the road, hands raised. Clara's heart was a hammer against her ribs, but her mind was cold and clear. She saw everything. There were perhaps 10 riders, their horses dusty and mean. They were focused on the driver and the guard, who were already on the ground, their hands bound. 2 men were at the back of the coach, prying at the strongbox bolted to the boot, the railroad's payroll. The rumors from the station were true. A man on a tall black horse rode forward. He was bigger than the others, his mask pulled down to reveal a thick, scarred neck. He wore 2 holsters, and his eyes, cold and blue, swept over the passengers with utter disinterest, until they landed on Clara. He smiled, a joyless baring of teeth. This, she knew, was Miles Thorne. "Well, now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Look at the pretty cargo. What's in the box?" "Driver." "Just railroad script," the driver yelled, his voice cracking. "Nothing for you." "I will be the judge of that." Thorne said. He nodded to his men, who returned to their work with pry bars. Clara's gaze was pulled from the scene by a flicker of movement high on the canyon rim. In the deep shadow, a man, silhouetted against the sky. No, 3 men. They were on horseback, but they were not with the gang. They were still watching. One of them, she saw with a jolt that had nothing to do with fear, was the smith from the station, Atsidi Nez. Thorne saw her looking. He half turned in his saddle, squinting up at the rim. "Got rats in the rocks, do we?" As if in answer, a rifle shot cracked from the rim. It was not aimed at the coach. It was aimed at a precarious pile of boulders high above the gang. The bullet struck, a chip of stone flew, and then, with a sound like grinding teeth, the rock slide began. It was not a large slide, but it was perfectly placed. A cascade of scree and dust poured down the canyon wall, cutting off the main body of the gang from their leader and the coach. Horses screamed and reared. "It is a diversion," Thorne roared, his blue eyes flashing with fury. "Get them!" Atsidi Nez was already moving. He and his 2 companions, a man and a younger boy, were riding down a switchback path Clara had not even seen, their movement swift and certain. They were not charging, they were flanking. The gang, confused, split its attention. Half turned to fire at the riders on the cliff, the other half still struggling with the strongbox. Atsidi and his companions used the chaos. They were not trying to fight the whole gang. They were trying to get to the coach. A shot from Atsidi's rifle took the hat off the man guarding the passengers. Another, from his companion, struck the arm of the man who had pulled Clara from the coach. The man howled, dropping his revolver. "So, get in," the driver screamed, scrambling to his feet and cutting his bonds on a sharp rock. "Get in the coach now." The minister was frozen, praying aloud. Mr. Finney was trying to burrow into the dust. Mrs. Gable, with a snarl of impatience, grabbed the minister by his collar and threw him toward the door. "Move, you fool!" Clara did not hesitate. She pushed the salesman, who was whimpering, and grabbed Mrs. Gable's hand, pulling her toward the step. The battle was a confusing swirl of red dust and blue smoke. Atsidi and his friends were using the rocks for cover, their shots precise, forcing the gang to keep their heads down. They were hopelessly outnumbered, but they were fighting with the land, not against it. As Clara scrambled into the coach, she saw the boy. He was young, perhaps 14, and he was with Atsidi's other companion, providing cover. A stray shot from Thorne's men ricocheted off the rock near him. The boy cried out and clutched his arm, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. "Go!" Atsidi yelled, his voice cutting through the din, not to Clara, but to the driver. "Go now!" The driver was on the box, the guard beside him, his rifle now free. The whip cracked like a gunshot, and the coach leaped forward, throwing Clara hard against the seat. She looked out the small rear window. The last she saw was Miles Thorne, his face contorted with rage, firing his revolver at the retreating coach. His voice, barely audible over the rattling wheels, followed them. "This is not over, this land. This water, it belongs to the strong." The coach did not stop for 2 miles. It ran until the horses were lathered and blowing, and the canyon had widened into a shallow wash. The driver finally pulled them to a halt, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins. "We are alive," the minister whispered, his eyes wide. "A miracle! Miracle!" Mrs. Gable snorted, adjusting her bonnet. That was skill, reverend, and a distraction. The sound of horses approaching made them all flinch. "Mr. Finney let out a small squeak. It was Nez and his two companions. They rode out of the dust, not as saviors, but as participants. The man, Atsidi, reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the coach, checking for damage, checking the passengers. His eyes met Clara's, and for the second time, she felt that profound, unsettling acknowledgement. The boy he was with was bleeding. The older man, his face grim, was holding a strip of cloth against the wound. But it was not enough. "He is hit," the man said to Atsidi in the dying language, his voice rough with worry. Before anyone else could move, Clara was out of the coach. She had her valise in her hand. She ripped it open, pushing past her dresses, past the useless letters, to her mother's sewing kit. She pulled out the small, sharp scissors and a roll of clean linen bandages she had packed for. She did not know what for. For this, apparently. She walked directly to the boy. The other dying man put a hand on his knife, his eyes narrowing. "Do not," Atsidi said, his voice quiet, but absolute. The man stopped. Clara looked not at Atsidi, but at the boy, who was watching her with wide, pain-filled eyes. "May I?" she said, her voice steady. She did not wait for an answer from the men. She spoke to the boy. "This will sting, but it must be cleaned." She tore open a small packet of her own lye soap and, using water from her canteen, she began to gently, practically, clean the graze. It was a nasty wound, a deep furrow from the bullet, but the bone was not broken. The boy hissed, but he did not pull away. Her hands were firm, efficient, and surprisingly gentle. She worked quickly. She bandaged the arm, her stitches in the cloth as neat as any she had ever made on a dress. When she was finished, she tied the knot and looked up. The three men were watching her, the suspicion in their faces replaced by a grudging respect. Even the minister had stepped out of the coach, his mouth open. Clara stood up, wiping her bloody hands on her already ruined skirt. "He will need to keep it clean, and he will be sore." Nez dismounted. He stood in front of her. He was taller than she had realized, and the quiet of the smithy was still on him, even here, in the aftermath of a gunfight. "You have a good hand," he said. "My mother taught me," she replied, her voice trembling only slightly. "They were after the railroad box," she said, more to herself than to him. "But he, the one in charge, he shouted about water." Atsidi looked at the dry, cracked earth around them. The wind was picking up, carrying the red dust. "The money is paper," he said. "The railroad script? It is just a symbol. They fight for the strong box, but the war is for the water." He gestured to the dry wash, to the parched mountains. "This is the law of the land, the only one that matters. Here, life does not come from a bank, or from a man in the east. It comes from the spring. Whoever holds the water holds life. The railroad knows this. Thorne knows this." He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to pin her to the spot. "And now, you know this." The coach driver called out, "We have to move. Miss before they regroup." Clara nodded. She packed her sewing kit, her hands stained with the boy's blood. She felt a profound shift, a settling in her bones. The letters in her pocket were not just hollow. They were a lie. Mr. Briggs and his civilized comforts were a fantasy. She had been brought here for a reason, but it was not the one she had been told. The pretty words were a cover for a war over a spring, a war that had just drawn its first blood in front of her. She climbed back into the coach. As it pulled away, she looked back. Nez and his companions were already turning their horses, heading back up into the rocks, the land swallowing them as if they were part of it. She watched until they were gone, his words echoing, louder than the rattling of the wheels. "Whoever holds the water holds life." The rest of the journey was a blur of dust and dread. The coach, with its mismatched society of the shaken, did not stop for pleasantries, Mr. Finney, the liquor salesman, had ceased offering his flask and was instead sipping from it quietly in the corner, his bravado gone. The minister read his Bible aloud, his voice a droning counterpoint to the rattle of the wheels, while Mrs. Gable stared out the window, her silence more potent than any sermon. Clara said nothing. She held her hands, still faintly stained. In her lap, the words of the bandit leader, Miles Thorne, and the quiet, grave statement from Atsidi Nez had woven themselves together in her mind. The water belongs to the strong. Whoever holds the water holds life. The letters in her pocket, the ones from Samuel Briggs, felt not just false, but obscene. They spoke of gardens in a land of thirst, of civilized comforts in a place of raw survival. They arrived at Red Butte just as the sun was bleeding into the western cliffs, painting the sky a violent, beautiful red. The town was larger than the station, but rawer. It was a scar of new lumber and canvas tents laid over the red earth. A main street, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, was lined with a sheriff's office, its fresh paint already peeling, a small, hopeful chapel with no steeple, and, dominating the street, a large 2-story false front building, Briggs Mercantile and Provisions. The coach pulled to a stop. The minister scrambled out, falling to his knees to kiss the dusty ground. Mrs. Gable gave him a look of profound disgust, accepted the driver's hand, and marched directly to the town's single small hotel. Mr. Finney disappeared into the saloon. Clara stood alone by the coach, her valise in her hand. The air was cooling rapidly, and the wind had a sharp, lonely sound. She had come this far. She had to see it through. She crossed the street, her boots sinking into the fine, deep dust. The Mercantile was bright, its windows filled with bolts of cloth, sacks of flour, and gleaming tins of Eastern goods. She pushed the door open. A small bell tinkled. The man behind the counter was not what she expected. He was soft, not fat, but soft, with pale, smooth hands and a waistcoat of green brocade that seemed ridiculous in this dusty place. He had a round, pleasant face, sandy hair, and a smile that was quick and welcoming. "May I help you, miss?" His voice was buoyant. "You are new in town. I see fresh off the stage. A difficult journey. I am told. An altercation." "I am looking for Mr. Samuel Briggs," Clara said, her voice flat. She was too tired for pleasantries. The man's smile widened, becoming proprietary. "Then you have found him, my dear lady. I am Samuel Briggs, at your service." He bowed, a slick, practiced movement. "And you, I presume, are my Clara, Miss Mallory." He came around the counter, his hand extended. "You are even lovelier than I had hoped, though the journey has clearly been trying." His eyes, she saw now, did not match his smile. His mouth was warm, but his eyes were a pale, cold blue, as assessing as a man weighing grain. "We need to speak, Mr. Briggs," Clara said, not taking his hand. His smile faltered. "Just for a moment." Of course. A terrible business, I am sure. Come into my office. We will have some tea. We have much to discuss." He led her to a small, cluttered room behind the store. He fussed with a kettle on a small stove, all the while talking about the town, the railroad, the bright future. "It is a land of opportunity. Clara, a man who is smart, who knows how to deal with the right people, can build an empire here, and a wife, a respectable, practical wife, is the cornerstone of such an empire." He handed her a cup of tea. She did not drink it. "The letters," she said, her voice quiet. "Ah, the letters," he beamed. "Did they please you, I confess? I am a man of commerce, not poetry. I hired the schoolmarm in the next county to draft them. A woman's touch. You see, I knew what a lady of your standing would wish to hear." "You did not write them," she stated, It was not a question. "I signed them," he said brightly. "Does it matter who held the pen? When the sentiment was mine, I wanted you here, and you are here." "Why?" Clara asked. "Why me, a woman you have never met? From a family with nothing?" Samuel Briggs sat down. The light from the window was failing, and in the dimness, the warmth fell away from his face, leaving only the cold, practical angles. "Do not sell yourself short, my dear. Your father may be poor, but the Mallorys are an old name in that county. They have honor. That is more than most in this territory can say. I need that." "You need honor." "I need the appearance of it," he corrected, his voice losing its buoyant edge. "I am a businessman. I have connections with the railroad. They are particular. They need partners who are stable, settled, a man with a good wife, from a good family. That is a man they can trust." "And the dowry," Clara said, the word tasting like ash. "A practical matter." Briggs waved a soft hand. "A token of your family's commitment. A small investment in our shared future. It is not about the money, Clara. It is about the merging of interests." He wanted the farm, or the deed to it, as collateral. He wanted to buy her family's name to impress the railroad, the ambush, the fight for water. Mr. Briggs was not a victim of it. He was a part of it. He was the civilized face of the same greed that drove Miles Thorne. "No," Clara said. Briggs blinked. "No, my dear, you are exhausted. The shock." "I said no," Clara repeated, standing up. The teacup rattled in its saucer. "This is not a marriage. It is a business arrangement, a purchase, and I am not for sale. Mr. Briggs." He stood up slowly. The smile was gone. The cold, pale eyes were flat. "Miss Mallory," he said, and his voice was suddenly hard. "You misunderstand your position. You are in Red Butte. You are a woman, alone. You came here, very publicly, to be my wife. What do you think becomes of your reputation if I am forced to say that you were unsuitable?" He stepped closer. "Think very carefully. The wind in this town, it carries whispers. A jilted bride is a tragedy, but a woman who arrives unescorted, only to be turned away, that is something else entirely, something soiled." Clara felt a cold sickness, but also a pure, clean rage. "You would threaten my name after you lured me here with lies." "I am a practical man," Samuel Briggs said, adjusting his brocade vest. "I am offering you a home, security, a name. You are offering me. What defiance that has no value here." Clara turned and walked out of the office, through the store. The bell tinkled as she slammed the door behind her, leaving him in the gathering dark. She stood on the wooden boardwalk, her valise at her feet. The street was empty. The sun was gone, leaving a cold, purple twilight. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer, desolate loneliness of her situation. She had no money for the hotel. She had no way to go back. She was, as he had said, entirely alone. Across the street, a man was posting a notice on the board outside the sheriff's office. He finished and walked away. She heard the rhythmic sound of a hammer on metal, a familiar sound from that afternoon, the smithy. She looked down the street and saw the glow of the forge, a point of warm, orange light in the blue dusk. And then she saw him. At Sidi Nez, he was leading a horse, its hooves newly shod, toward the livery stable. He had not ridden on. He lived here. He finished with the horse and turned. He saw her, standing like a statue outside the bright, false front of the mercantile, her bag at her feet. He knew. She did not have to say a word. He knew what a man like Briggs was, and he knew what she had faced. He walked across the street. He did not rush. His pace was as measured as his hammer strokes. He stopped a respectful 5 feet away, not crowding her, not offering pity. He just stood, a silent, solid presence in the growing dark. He looked at her, then at the mercantile door. He glanced at the notice board, where the new paper was flapping in the wind. "Truth," he said, his voice low and calm, seeming to come from the earth itself. "It is cool water. Men try to dam it. They try to hide it, to poison it, but it always builds, and it will overflow eventually." Clara followed his gaze to the notice. A man passing by squinted at it, then spat in the dust. "Damn railroad," the man grumbled to his companion. "Sending surveyors. 3 days. They mean to mark Coyote Spring." "That is Dineland," the other man said, his voice worried. "Not if the railroad says it ain't. It is sacred water, they say." The word hit Clara like a stone. Sacred water. The water Atsidi had said was life. The water Miles Thorne was paid to steal. The water Samuel Briggs wanted to control through his respectable empire. Briggs himself stepped out of the mercantile, perhaps to call her back, to apologize, to threaten further. He stopped dead when he saw her, and when he saw who she was with. His face, which had been tight with anger, smoothed into something worse, a slick, knowing smile. He looked from Clara to Atsidi, and then he caught the eye of the 2 townsmen who were still lingering. Briggs raised an eyebrow, a small, shared gesture of contempt. The men's expressions changed. They looked at Clara, standing in the street with her bag. They looked at the tall, silent dinesmith. The whispers started instantly. "That is the one? The mail-order bride? Did you see Briggs turned her out? And look at her, already running to the Indian, shameless!" The words, jilted bride and Indian warrior, hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. Clara felt the sting of them, the heat of 100 judging eyes. She had nowhere to go. The hotel would not take her without money, and now, no respectable house would take her at all. Atsidi stood unmoving, his face impassive. He had heard, he had seen. He was a man accustomed to this, to being the target of whispers and contempt. "The wind is cold tonight," he said, as if the last minute had not happened. It was a simple statement of fact. He nodded down the street, toward the glow of his forge. "There is a hogan nearby. It is empty. It is warm. You will be safe." A hogan, a traditional dine dwelling. Not a room, not charity. It was shelter. Clara looked at the cold, judgmental face of Samuel Briggs, who was watching from his doorway, his arms crossed. She looked at the curious, hostile faces of the townsmen. Then she looked at Atsidi Nez, who offered nothing but what he said warmth and safety. She bent and picked up her valise. "Thank you, Mr. Nez," she said, her voice clear in the cold air. She walked away from the mercantile, away from the man who had tried to buy her, and toward the glow of the forge. Atsidi Nez walked with her, not beside her, but a step ahead, his presence a silent shield against the whispers that followed them all the way down the dusty street. The relationship had begun, not with a lie, but with a choice. The hogan was round, built of earth and timber, with a single opening facing the rising sun. It smelled of dry cedar and the clean, mineral scent of the packed dirt floor. It was nothing like the square, drafty farmhouse she had left. But when Clara Mallory lay down on the simple cot Atsidi Nez had provided, she felt a sense of safety that Red Butte, with its false-fronted stores and whispering streets, had already stripped from her. The sound of the forge woke her before dawn. It was not the jarring ring of a bell, but a rhythmic, dependable percussion, the sound of a man at work. She rose, her body stiff, and looked at her new home in the pale light. It was an empty, functional space, a shelter against the wind. But Clara was a farmer's daughter. She did not know how to be idle, and she did not know how to live in a place without making it a home. Her first act was one of defiance. She took the small amount of pin money her mother had sewn into the hem of her skirt, money Samuel Briggs had not known about, and walked to the mercantile. He was there, of course, polishing an apple, his brocade vest looking even more foolish in the morning light. His smile was gone, replaced by a cold, appraising stare. The few other customers in the store, men in dusty hats, went silent. They watched her. "I need," Clara said, her voice clear and carrying in the silence. "1 sack of white cornmeal, 20 pounds, a side of bacon, a bar of lye soap, and a small cast-iron skillet, the 10-inch one." She was not asking for credit. She was not begging. She was a customer. She placed her coins on the counter, one by one. Briggs's face was a mask of polite fury. He had meant to starve her out, to make her crawl back. He had not anticipated she had resources, however small. He could not, in front of these men, refuse a cash sale. He shoveled the cornmeal into a sack, his movements jerky and angry. "That all, Miss Mallory," he said, the miss a deliberate, insulting emphasis. "No," she replied, her eyes scanning the shelves. "I need seeds. Whatever you have that will grow here. Squash, beans." He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Grow here. Nothing grows here but greed. Miss, and you seem to have run short of that currency. The seeds, Mr. Briggs." He threw a few small paper packets on the counter. She paid, her coin purse significantly lighter, and gathered her provisions. She walked out, her back straight, feeling the weight of every eye in the store. She returned to the hogan that afternoon, behind the small dwelling, in a patch of earth protected from the worst of the wind by a small rock outcropping. Clara began to dig. The ground was hard, resistant. She used a piece of sharpened scrap metal that Seedy had left by the forge, using it to break the crust. She had no water to spare, but she planted the seeds anyway, a desperate, stubborn act of faith. She set up a small, makeshift kitchen outside the hogan, away from the flammable timber, building a rock oven. That night, the air around the smithy held a new smell. Mixed with the coal smoke and hot iron, the scent of baking cornbread. She was bringing the warmth, the small domestic rituals of life, to this place of hard labor. The Dine children were the first to approach. They were curious about this pale, quiet woman who was living in the old hogan. They watched her from a distance, small, silent figures. Clara, remembering the boy at the ambush, did not try to coax them. She simply went about her work. One day, as she was grinding corn, a small girl, braver than the rest, crept closer. Clara held up the stone. "Mano," she said, naming her tool. The girl watched. Clara pointed to the corn. "Dine maize." The girl giggled and corrected her. A soft, musical word. Clara smiled. "Teach me." And so the lessons began. They taught her the words for corn, for wind, for water. In return, she taught them English. "Spoon," she would say, holding one up. "Sky," "horse." It was a fair trade. Atsidi would watch from the forge, the rhythm of his hammer unbroken. But in the evenings, when the work was done and the forge cooled, he would come. Not to her hogan, but to the small patch of turned earth she called her garden. "The wind will take this," he said one night. He was not criticizing. It was a statement of fact. "Then I will plant it again," Clara said, her hands on her hips. He looked at her, a long, appraising look. "The wind here is not like your wind. It comes from the north. It is a razor. You must plant on the south side of the rocks, and you need water. Not just any water. You need the deep water, the sweet water. And where do I find that?" He gestured. "You do not find it. You listen for it." He taught her. He took her walking, not on the flat, exposed plain, but into the small, dry arroyos and canyons just outside the town. He showed her how to read the land. He pointed to a patch of willow, their leaves a brighter green than the surrounding scrub. "Water is there," he said. He showed her how the smallest crack in a rock face could, after a rain, hold moisture for weeks. He taught her to read the movement of the air, not just as wind, but as a current, a living thing that carried news. "The air is heavy," he would say, Long before the clouds appeared, rain is coming. He was teaching her to survive in his world, and in doing so, he was sharing himself in the only way he knew how. Clara's presence did not go unnoticed, and her isolation was soon broken by an unlikely ally. A large woman with a flour-dusted apron and a face like a friendly bulldog marched down the street and stopped at the smithy. "You are Clara Mallory," the woman stated. "I am Hattie Rose. I run the diner. I was on that coach with you, though I expect you do not remember. I was the widow in black. I am still a widow, but I find black too hot for this climate." Clara, stunned, could only nod. "I heard you told Samuel Briggs to go to hell," Hattie continued, her voice a cheerful boom. "I have been waiting for someone to do that for 5 years. He is a snake in a fancy vest. But you, child, you look half-starved. You cannot live on cornmeal in spite." Hattie thrust a basket into her hands. Inside was a roasted chicken, a loaf of fresh bread, and a jar of apple butter. "This is not charity," Hattie said, before Clara could protest. "This is a loan. You are a practical woman, I can tell. You have good hands. You can come by the diner 2 hours every morning and help me with the baking. I will pay you in food and friendship. The second is harder to come by." Hattie Rose's diner, the Open Hand, was the true center of Red Butte. It was where the ranchers, the railroad men, the miners, and the townspeople came to eat, but also to talk. Hattie, with her sharp wit and generous pies, was the town's conscience. She had, as she put it, outlasted 2 husbands and a drought, and she was not afraid of Samuel Briggs or the railroad. It was at Hattie's that Clara met Jonah Cooper. He was a young man, not much older than Clara, with an open, honest face and sun-bleached hair. He worked for the railroad. His jacket bore the small brass button of the company, but there was no malice in him. He came in for breakfast, his hat in his hands, and his eyes found Clara, who was kneading dough in the back. He blushed. "Ma'am," he said, nodding to her. "Jonah Cooper. I work on the survey crew." He looked down at his boots. "I just wanted to say, what Mr. Briggs did, well, it was not right, not at all." His decency was as startling as Hattie's kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper," Clara said, her hands white with flour. "Jonah, please, ma'am." "Clara." The tension came when Jonah brought a broken axle to the smithy. Atsidie was at the forge. Clara was outside, watering her tiny, struggling bean plants with water she had hauled from the diner's well. Jonah was polite, respectful, to them both. "Mr. Nez, sir, they said you are the only one who can fix this. We hit a washout." Atsidie nodded, taking the axle, his assessment of the metal swift and professional. Jonah lingered, his hat in his hands, watching Clara. Those are bean plants, ma'am?" "I hope so, Jonah," she said with a small smile. "It is hard soil," he said, stating the obvious. "But not impossible," she replied. From the forge, the hammer blows were suddenly louder, harder. Atsidie did not look up, but the set of his shoulders was tight. It was not jealousy. It was the tension of the world. Jonah was a good man, but he wore the railroad's button. He was part of the machine that was coming for the water. Jonah, sensing the shift, nodded quickly. "Well, I will. I will come back for the axle." He tipped his hat to Clara, a gesture that was both sweet and sad, and left. Atsidie worked late into the night. A week later, Atsidie invited her, with a simple nod, to a gathering. It was not a party, it was a ceremony, a night of storytelling. An elder, his face a beautiful map of wrinkles, sat before a patch of smoothed sand. He told a story, not in English, but his hands moved, and from them trickled colored sand black, red, white. The patterns formed, shifted, and dissolved. He spoke of Coyote, the trickster, who was a hero one moment and a fool the next. He spoke of how Coyote, in his arrogance, had tried to hoard all the water, and how the people had suffered. The story was a warning, a lesson about balance. It was a clear, direct parallel to the railroad, but it was ancient, told with sadness rather than anger. Clara realized she was not just an observer. This story was now part of her story, too. She was no longer just the jilted bride, she was a witness. The nights grew colder. The wind, as Teased had warned, was a razor. One evening, as they sat outside, the forge banked. The air was still, holding a deep chill. "This is a hunting wind," Teased said quietly, staring into the darkness. "It reminds me of winter in Nebraska," Clara said, pulling her shawl tighter. "The hungry season." He looked at her, his usual impassivity broken by a shadow of memory. "We had a winter when I was a boy. The snow was this high." He held his hand to his chest. "The deer did not come. The army had put us on new land, land that did not know us. We went to the trading post. We had no money, only silver. The trader would not take it. He wanted green paper." He paused, his jaw tight. "My grandmother, she fell sick, a cough. She needed medicine. She needed food, but we had only silver. She died. Not from the sickness. She died from the cold, from a man who did not see her. He saw only what she did not have." He had never spoken so much. Clara's heart ached, not with pity, but with a fierce, shared understanding. He was not just a smith or a scout. He was a survivor of a war she had never even known was being fought. "Teased," she whispered, her hand moving, wanting to comfort, but she stopped. He was not looking for comfort. He was explaining. He was telling her why he was here, why the smithy, why the water. "They think the water is like their paper," he said, his voice hard. "Something to be owned, to be hoarded. They do not understand. Water is not a thing. It is a life. It is the blood of the land. You do not own it, you share it, or everything dies." The silence that followed was broken 2 days later by Hattie Rose. She marched down to the smithy, her face grim. "It is bad. Clara," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "The railroad has officially hired Miles Thorne and his men. They are calling them security guards for the survey team. Jonah is beside himself. He said he did not sign up for this, but he is one man. Thorne and his 20 cutthroats are now the law." Clara looked at her garden. The bean sprouts, which had finally broken the soil, were dead, killed by a small, unseasonable frost. All her work, for nothing. She looked at Teased. He was at the anvil. He had a railroad spike, a thick piece of raw steel, glowing orange in the forge, but he was not hammering it into a spike. He was flattening it, sharpening it, turning the weapon of the railroad into a tool, a plowshare. He pulled the metal from the forge, the light of it illuminating his face, all hard lines and absolute determination. He laid it on the anvil and raised his hammer. Clara walked over, picked up her ruined, frozen bean plants, and threw them into the forge. They hissed and vanished in a puff of smoke. Then she turned, walked to the pile of scrap, and picked up a broken shovel head. Teased stopped, his hammer in midair. Clara looked at him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes as hard as the steel. "Show me again," she said. "Show me where to dig." Their eyes met over the glowing metal. It was not a look of romance. It was a look of alliance. It was a promise, made in silence, born of shared labor and a hard, necessary anger. They would hold the water. They would hold this land, for everyone. The wind had a voice, and for 2 days it had not stopped screaming. It was a high, thin howl from the north, a razor of air that stripped moisture from the skin and sanity from the mind. It scoured the red earth, sending curtains of dust to sting the eyes and coat the tongue. It was a hunting wind, and on the second night, it brought the hunters. It was well past midnight. The town of Red Butte was dark. Its decent folk shuttered in. its less decent folk confined to the yellow lamplight of the saloon. At the end of the street, at the cluster of dwellings near the smithy, the wind was loudest. It tore at the brush roofs and a canvas supply tent, the noise a perfect cover for the sound of approaching horses. Clara was in the hogan, trying to sleep. A blanket pulled over her head to muffle the sound. The air in the small, round structure was cold, but the earth walls held. She was thinking of her failed garden, of the whispers that followed her from Briggs Mercantile, of the sheer, impossible hardness of this land. A horse screamed. It was not a normal sound. It was high, a sound of pure terror. Clara's heart stopped. She threw off the blanket. The wind was still howling, but beneath it was a new sound, men's voices, shouting in English, rough and drunk. And then the smell, unmistakable, oily and acrid, kerosene. She scrambled to the door. The night was no longer dark. It was lit with a terrible, moving, orange light. Miles Thorne's men were here. There were at least a dozen of them, riding in a loose, chaotic circle, throwing torches. They were not attacking the main town. They were attacking this small, specific cluster of dine homes. The canvas supply tent, full of dried corn and hides, was already a column of fire. A neighboring hogan, where a woman named Natani lived with her 3 children, had fire catching on its roof. "Burn 'em out," a voice roared, followed by a drunken laugh. "Burn the rats." Clara ran out, her shawl held over her mouth against the smoke. The heat was a physical blow. She saw Natani burst from her home, clutching her youngest baby, her 2 small sons clinging to her skirt. The family huddled against the wall of the smithy, staring in terror as the fire licked at their home. Natani was screaming, her voice cracking. "Sanya, where is Sanya?" Her daughter, the little girl with the bright eyes, the one who had taught Clara the word for water. Clara looked at the hogan. The doorway was a sheet of flame. "Get water," a voice boomed. And it was not a raider's. It was Hattie Rose, charging down the street in a man's heavy overcoat over her nightgown, 2 horse buckets swinging in her fists. She lived above her diner, and the commotion had woken her. She was not a woman who waited for a sheriff. "Hattie the child," Clara screamed, pointing. "She is still inside." Hattie did not hesitate for a second. She ran at the burning hogan, threw the contents of 1 bucket straight at the doorway, and vanished into the steam and smoke. "Clara!" Hattie's voice yelled from the inferno. "The other bucket now!" Clara grabbed the second bucket, her hands shaking, and followed. The smoke was so thick she could not breathe. She found Hattie in the center of the single room, stamping out embers. The girl, Sanya, was in the back, under a pile of blankets, silent with terror. "Grab her!" Hattie yelled. She shoved the child into Clara's arms. "Go, the roof is coming down!" Clara, half carrying, half dragging the girl, stumbled out into the night, emerging just as a section of the timber roof collapsed in a volcano of sparks. Hattie followed a moment later, coughing, her face black with soot, her hair singed. She pushed them both toward Natani, who fell upon her daughter with a choked cry. The fight was not just one of fire. Gunshots cracked through the air, sharp and deadly. Atsidi Nez was not idle. He and the other dine men had taken cover, using the solid mass of the forge and the stacks of iron as a fortress. They were returning fire, their shots careful, aimed not to kill but to drive off. A shadow detached itself from the smoke. A large man on a large black horse, Miles Thorne. He sat apart, watching the chaos his men had wrought. He saw Clara, Hattie, and the women, and he laughed. "Look at 'em!" he roared to his men, scurrying like wet rats. He saw a figure move in the shadows by the forge. He raised his revolver. "Come on out, warrior, I came here for you." Atsidi moved, not from the forge, but from the darkness behind Thorne. He was on foot, silent, a rifle in his hand. He was trying to draw the leader away from the burning homes, away from the families. He fired. Not at Thorn, but at the ground by his horse's feet. The horse reared, startled. "So there you are," Thorn bellowed, recognizing him. He spurred his horse into the darkness. Between the smithy and the woodpile, the shadows were deep, the only light the unsteady flicker of the distant fires. Thorn fired twice, the heavy slugs thudding into the timber stack where Sadie had taken cover. "I owe you for the canyon, you red devil." Sadie moved again, melting from one shadow to the next. He fired. Thorn cried out, a sound of surprise and pain, clutching his arm. The shot had grazed him, drawing blood. Enraged, Thorn emptied his revolver into the darkness. "Got you!" he screamed, as one of his bullets was met with a dull sound and a sharp intake of breath. That is how it feels. Sadie was hit. He had stayed low, but a ricochet, or perhaps a lucky shot, had torn through the flesh of his left shoulder. The pain was a bright, clean fire. He did not make another sound. He pressed himself against the earth, controlling his breath, becoming stone. Thorn, hearing nothing, laughed. "Run off to die, did you? That is fine. We are done here," he whistled, a shrill, ugly sound. "Let him cook. Boys, back to the saloon. This round is on the railroad." The raiders galloped off, their laughter and curses swallowed by the wind. The silence that fell was worse than the noise. It was filled with the crackle of the dying fires and the soft, terrible sound of weeping. Dawn came slowly, a reluctant gray light that exposed the full measure of the night's work. 2 hogans were gone, just smoking holes in the ground. The supply tent was ashes. The air stank of wet soot and despair. Hattie was already organizing, herding the displaced families toward her diner, promising hot coffee and breakfast. "We will rebuild," she said, her voice hoarse, to everyone and no one. "Damn them all, we will rebuild." Clara sat on a log near her own hogan, which had been spared. She had helped Hattie with the children, her hands raw from the heat, her dress streaked with soot. But now, in the cold light, the shaking started. It began in her hands and spread, a deep, bone-rattling tremor. She had seen fire before, but this was different. This was not an act of nature. This was an act of men, a hatred so profound it sought to erase people from the earth. The courage of the night was gone, leaving only a hollow, sickening fear. She saw him walking out of the gray light. That's Sadie. His face was a mask of soot and weariness. His shirt was torn, the left side of it dark and stiff with blood. Clara gasped, the tremor in her hands forgotten. "Sadie, you are hurt." She stood, her practical nature surfacing, her mind already on bandages and clean water. "Let me help. You must let me clean it." He did not stop her. He did not speak. He just walked to the anvil, the great solid heart of his smithy, and leaned a hand against it, as if to steady himself, or the world. He looked at the ashes of his neighbor's home. Clara, seeing his silence, his stillness, felt her own resolve fracture again. The fear came back, not as a tremor, but as a wave. "I cannot," she whispered, the words pulled from her against her will. "I do not know if I can do this." He turned, his face unreadable. I am not like you," she stammered, ashamed of her own voice. This violence. They come in the night, they burn homes, they want to kill you, and they will keep coming." She looked at her own, trembling hands. "Back home, in Nebraska, we fought the frost, we fought the drought. It was hard, but it was clean. This is a poison. I am afraid. Sadie, I am so afraid. I cannot breathe." He watched her, his dark eyes holding the reflection of the smoking ruins. He had seen fear before. He had seen people break. He was silent for a long time. The wind had finally died, and the silence was vast. He straightened, pushing away from the anvil. He did not step toward her. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer soft words. He raised his right hand, the broad, calloused hand of a smith, and he laid it flat against his own chest, over his heart. "This is my life," he said, his voice low, rough from the smoke. "It is the forge, it is the dust, it is the blood on the stones, and it is the fire in the night." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering, cutting through her fear, demanding she see the truth. "I am this land. This land is this fight. It is not clean. It is not pretty. It is not safe." His eyes held hers. His voice dropped to a near whisper, a question that was not about love, but about survival, a question that held the weight of the entire territory. "Can you handle me?" He was not asking if she could tend his wound. He was not asking if she found him brave. He was asking if she could bear the weight of his world, the world that he was, the wind, the blood, the dust. He was offering her nothing but the hard, violent, beautiful truth. Clara looked at his hand, flat against his heart. She looked at the blood drying on his shoulder. She looked at the ashes of Natani's home, and she looked at her own 2 hands, which had, just hours ago, pulled a child from a fire. She was still afraid, but she was no longer shaking. Her answer was not a word. She walked past him into her hogan. She emerged a moment later with her mother's sewing kit, a roll of clean linen, and her canteen. She walked back to him. He had not moved. She stopped in front of him, so close she could feel the heat of his body. "Turn," she said. Her voice was not the voice of the frightened girl from Nebraska. It was not the voice of the jilted bride. It was the voice of a woman who had made a choice. Atsidi held her gaze for one more long, silent moment. Then, in a gesture of profound, unspoken trust, he turned his back to her, offering her his wound. Clara's hands, now steady, set to work. The town was buzzing. The fire was a visible, smoking declaration of war. Jonah Cooper was the first to come, his face sick. "Clara, Mr. Nez, I swear on my mother's grave, I did not know. This is Thorn. This is not the railroad." "Who pays him?" "Jonah," Clara asked, her voice quiet as she tied the bandage around Atsidi's shoulder. Jonah's face crumpled. "I know." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "And I have to tell you, I was in the survey office. They are posting the new maps. They are moving on Coyote Spring. Not in a few weeks. Next week, Tuesday, they are going to stake it. And Thorn's men, they are official security. They are going to be there, to provoke a fight, to get cause." "Thank you for the warning, Jonah," Clara said. "I am quitting," he said. I will not be a part of this." "No," Atsidi said, his voice rough. He turned to face the young man. "You will not quit. You will stay. You will be a good man, and a good man is a witness. You will watch, and you will remember what you see." Jonah looked at the dinesmith, and a new, hard resolve settled on his young face. He nodded. "I will be a witness." While Jonah brought a warning, Hattie Rose brought a weapon. She stormed into her diner, which was crowded with men, and slammed a sheet of paper onto the counter. "This is a petition," she boomed. "It states that Coyote Spring is a public resource, for all people, settler and dine, and it demands the council recognize that right. We are not animals to be fenced off from water. You will sign, or I will know the reason why." And as Hattie gathered signatures, Samuel Briggs began his own campaign. He stood on his porch in his clean vest and spread his poison. "A terrible tragedy," he said to the fearful townsfolk. "But what can one expect when people step outside their station? When a woman of questionable judgment cohabits with a savage, it draws trouble. It invites this." The whispers grew louder. "The Indian's woman. She brought this on us. Seducing him. Shamed us all." Clara heard the whispers. They were like small, biting insects. She ignored them. Atsidi returned to his forge, his arm in a sling. He could not swing the heavy hammer, but he could work. He had a crate of new iron railroad spikes. He took one, locked it in the vise, and with a smaller hammer and a chisel, he began to work. He was not making a weapon. He was not making a tool to sell. He was carving into the hard steel. He was etching a pattern, a dine symbol for rain, for water. He was taking their weapon, their spike, and he was marking it with his own truth. The community, seeing this, rallied. Hattie had her petition, Jonah had his date, and Atsidi had his forge. They would go to Coyote Spring on Tuesday. They would meet lawlessness with law, and threats with their simple, unmovable presence. They would stand together. The air on Tuesday was not air at all. It was a weight. The sky over Red Butte was a pale, sickly yellow, and the sun was a white disk, offering heat but no true light. There was no wind. The screaming gales of the week before had given way to a dead, oppressive calm. Hattie rose, her face set in grim lines, loaded the last of the water casks onto her wagon. "It is a day for devils," she muttered, wiping her hands on her apron. Too quiet. They were a small, determined band. Hattie, with her wagon and her petition, now signed by nearly half the town's decent folk, Atsidi, his left arm bound tight to his chest, his good hand resting on the stock of a rifle in his saddle scabbard. Clara, her valise packed not with clothes, but with bandages, clean water, and a small, heavy iron skillet. A half-dozen other small ranchers and dine families, including Natani and her children, who had lost everything in the fire. They were not an army. They were a community, riding out to Coyote Spring to claim their presence. Jonah Cooper was waiting for them at the mouth of Coyote Wash, the wide, dry canyon that was the only wagon path to the spring. He looked pale, his youthful face strained. "They are already up there," he said, his voice low. "Thorne and his whole gang. They are securing the perimeter for the surveyors. They are drinking." "Let them," Hattie said, her chin jutting. "We are not here to fight them. We are here to meet the surveyors. We have the law on our side." Atsidi said nothing. He was looking at the sky, not at the ridge where the men were. His eyes scanned the horizon, and his nostrils flared, as if he were tasting the air. "Hattie," he said, his voice quiet but cutting through the stillness. "We should not be in the wash. We should take the high trail." "The wagons cannot take the high trail, Atsidi," Hattie said, her voice tight with impatience. "The children, the water, we have to go through the wash. It is only 2 miles. "The air is wrong," he said. He looked at the sky, which was darkening in the high country to the north, a deep, bruised purple. "It is just a summer storm," Jonah said, though his voice wavered. "It will break the heat." "There is no just a storm here," Atsidi replied. "We move, now, and we move fast." They spurred the horses, the wagons rattling over the dry, rocky bed of the arroyo. The canyon walls rose on either side, 100 feet of sheer red rock, creating a perfect, natural funnel. The heat was suffocating, the silence so profound that Clara could hear the leather of her saddle creaking. Then the wind hit. It was not a wind. It was a physical blow, a downward pressure that stole the air from their lungs and brought with it the smell of ozone and wet dust. The sky, which had been pale yellow, turned a deep, churning, greenish black. A single massive bolt of lightning split the sky to the north, and the thunder did not roll. It exploded, a sharp crack that sounded like the mountains themselves were splitting. Atsidi roared, a single word in Dine, a word of pure command. "High ground, now leave the wagons." But it was too late. The sound came first. It was not the sound of water. It was the sound of 1,000 trees being uprooted, the sound of a freight train where no tracks lay, a deep, grinding, liquid roar that shook the fillings in their teeth. Clara looked up the wash, where there had been dry rock. There was now a moving wall, a 30-foot-high curl of brown, churning water, froth and foam, carrying with it entire trees, boulders, and the debris of the high country, a flash flood. "The children!" Natani screamed, her face a mask of terror. Her wagon, the one Hattie had given her, was stuck, its wheels locked between two boulders. Her two small boys were inside. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed, rearing, their eyes white. The ranchers scattered, trying to force their terrified cattle up the steep, crumbling sides of the canyon. Atsidi was off his horse, his face a mask of cold focus. "Clara, the rope Hattie's wagon." Clara did not question. She ran, her skirt tangling in her legs, and ripped the coil of heavy hemp rope from the side of Hattie's wagon. Atsidi was already at Natani's wagon, fighting the current, which was now a swirling, knee-deep river. His bad arm was a liability, but he used his body as a wedge, placing himself between the water and the wagon. Jonah Cooper was there, too, his fear forgotten, replaced by a desperate, focused energy. "The current is too fast," he yelled. "Tie it to the wagon," Atsidi commanded Clara. "Anchor it." Clara, her hands raw, her fingers fumbling with the knot her father had taught her, secured the rope to the axle of Hattie's heavier, more stable wagon, which was on slightly higher ground. "It is done." Atsidi took the other end of the rope and tied it around his own waist with his one good hand. He grabbed Jonah. "Hold the line. Go to the children. I will hold the rope." Jonah and another rancher took the line, wading into the now waist-deep, furious water. The main wall had not hit, but the precursor wave was powerful enough to pull a man from his feet. Clara stood by the anchor wagon, her knuckles white, playing out the rope, her feet braced in the mud. She was the anchor. A small herd of goats, belonging to another family, was trapped on a small, dissolving island of sand. The rancher, his face stricken, watched them bleat in terror as the water rose around them. The water was rising, a foot every second. The noise was deafening. And on the ridge, they appeared, Miles Thorne and his men. They were not trapped. They were on high, safe ground. And they were watching. They were laughing. "Look at 'em!" Thorne's voice boomed, carrying over the roar. "Rats in a trap!" Jonah and the rancher reached Natani's wagon. They grabbed the two small boys, pulling them from the back. As they turned, Natani's youngest, Sania's brother, slipped from the rancher's grasp. The current took him instantly, a small, dark shape tumbling in the brown water. "No!" Natani screamed, a sound of pure agony. Jonah Cooper did not hesitate. He dove, a desperate, full-body lunge, into the churning water, disappearing completely. An agonizing second passed. Then he surfaced, sputtering, his arm locked around the child's small chest. He fought the current, kicking, screaming with effort, and finally made it to the shallow, muddy bank, where he collapsed, coughing, pushing the child onto the sand. He lay there, shaking, his face pressed to the mud. He looked up at Clara, who was watching him, her heart in her throat. His face was not one of triumph. It was one of pure, agonizing horror. Thorne! Jonah choked, the words torn from him, the water pouring from his mouth. "He killed my brother, my older brother, Ben, in Texas." "Jonah, save your strength," Clara pleaded. "No," he cried, his voice raw. It was a river, just like this, a dispute over water rights. Ben was on the rope, I was on the bank, and Thorne was there. He just smiled, and he cut the rope." Jonah was sobbing now, clutching the small, coughing child to his chest. He cut the rope. He watched him drown, and he smiled. A scream from Hattie cut through the moment. "The marker, look!" Clara turned. On the ridge. Thorne had stopped laughing. He saw his chance. The chaos was perfect, the ancient heavy stone that marked the community's boundary. The one Hattie's petition was meant to support. was half submerged at the edge of the wash. Thorn and two of his men spurred their horses down a small game trail. Ignoring the flood, they were strong. On fresh horses, they rode to the marker, and with a grunt, the two men dislodged it, rolling the sacred ancient stone into a sling. "No!" Hattie screamed, running toward them, but she was too late. Thorn saw her. He saw her petition papers, clutched in her hand. He spurred his horse through the shallow water, and as he passed, he leaned down and snatched the papers. Laughing, he waved them in the air, a white flag of surrender, and then let them go. The community's legal hopes scattering and dissolving into the brown water. He tipped his hat to Clara, a gesture of pure mockery, and rode off with the stone. At that exact moment, the main wall of water hit. The roar became a physical thing. The world dissolved. Natani's wagon was lifted, tossed like a child's toy, and shattered. The force of it sent a secondary wave, a liquid fist, smashing into the bank where Clara stood. The ground beneath her feet simply ceased to exist. She was in the water. It was not water, it was a cold, brown, suffocating force, a liquid monster. It tore her shawl from her, ripped her hair from its pins. Her heavy skirts were a deadly anchor, pulling her down. She could not breathe. She could not see. She was tumbling, end over end. She heard her name, a sound that was not a sound, that was ripped from a man's throat. Clara. At Sidi, he was still tied to the rope, his other end tied to the wagon. He was safe, anchored, but she was not. He did not hesitate. With his one good hand, he took his skinning knife, and with a single furious motion, he cut the rope that tied him to safety. He cut the rope that anchored him to the bank. He threw himself into the main channel, into the heart of the flood. A man with one good arm, launching himself at an impossible, dying target. She surfaced, choking, grabbing at the air, only to be pulled down again. Then he was there, his arm, his good arm, locked around her, a band of steel. He had her. But the flood had them both. The water was too fast, too strong. It was carrying them toward a narrow bend in the canyon where the water was smashing against the rock wall. They would be crushed. "Hold!" he roared in her ear, his voice barely audible. Clara was too terrified to do anything but cling to him. He was not fighting the current. He was using it. He kicked, his legs powerful, angling them not toward the bank, which was impossible, but toward a single, massive, ancient cottonwood tree that stood on a small bend, its trunk half submerged but holding. He used his one good arm, the arm that was not holding her, as a rudder, as a shield. They hit the tree with a force that should have shattered them. Atsidi took the full impact. He wrapped his good arm around the trunk, his muscles screaming. His wounded left arm, the sling long gone, was smashed between his body and the tree. Clara heard him cry out, a sharp, choked sound of pure agony. But his grip did not loosen. He held her, and he held the tree. His body was a shield, his arm an anchor, and they clung together, two small, living things, as the world of water and debris roared past them, trying to pull them into the dark. The flood passed as quickly as it had come. 5 minutes of elemental rage, and then it was gone, leaving behind a new landscape. The wash was scoured clean, replaced by a thick, treacherous layer of rich, dark silt. It was over. Atsidi's arm, the good one, was shaking so badly he could barely hold the tree. His other arm was a ruin, his face pale and slick with pain. Clara was alive, coughing, her lungs aching, her body a mass of bruises. Slowly, they pulled themselves onto the new, muddy bank. The survivors were scattered, shocked but alive. The wagons were gone. The livestock was gone. And Hattie was standing by a muddy hole, the place where the boundary stone had been. Her face was not one of relief. It was one of pure, cold fury. "He took it," she whispered, her voice shaking. He took the stone. He stole our proof." The wind was gone. The roar of the water was gone. The only sound was the weeping of Natani and the soft, sucking sound of the new, rich mud. The air was washed clean, but it was not peaceful. It was a terrible, strained silence. The silence of a people who had survived the worst nature could throw at them, only to realize the true enemy was still out there, dry and laughing, on high ground. Hattie Rose looked at Jonah, who was still holding the child he had saved. She looked at Atsidi, who was leaning against the cottonwood, his eyes closed in pain, while Clara ripped her own petticoat into strips to bind his shattered arm. "He knows," Hattie said, her voice hard as iron. "Thorn saw you, Jonah. He saw you save that boy. He knows you are a witness. He saw all of us. He thinks he beat us." She picked up a stick, her hands shaking with rage. "He did not. The water took our proof, but it left us witnesses. We will go to the town. We will go to that meeting. We will have this out. We will not be moved." They walked back to Red Butte not as a delegation, but as the wreckage of a battle. They were a straggle of mud-caked survivors, their face streaked with silt and shock, their clothes ripped and heavy. Hattie Rose's wagon was gone, her petition was gone, and the community's ancient boundary stone was gone. Atsidi Nez walked beside Clara, a silent, towering figure of pain. His left arm was a ruin, lashed to his chest with what was left of Clara's petticoat, his face pale and tight beneath its mask of grime. Jonah Cooper, his youthful face aged a decade by the water and the confession, carried the small boy he had saved, the child's parents walking beside him in a daze. When they reached the main street, the town stopped. Men stepped out of the saloon, their card games forgotten. Women peered from behind curtains. Samuel Briggs, standing on the porch of his mercantile in a clean shirt, his morning coffee in hand, let the cup stall halfway to his lips. His expression, one of smug satisfaction, curdled into something else as he took in the full spectacle of their return. They did not stop for pity. Hattie Rose, her gray hair wild and matted with mud, her dress torn, marched straight for the town hall, which also served as the courthouse. "They are in there," she said, her voice a raw rasp. "The railroad men, they were having their meeting without us." She kicked the door open. The room, built to hold 30, held nearly 60. It was hot, packed, and smelled of sweat, tobacco, and the smug odor of clean wool suits. At the front, at a heavy oak table, sat the railroad surveyors, their maps spread out. With them was their land agent, a man named Harris, with a tidy beard and the dead eyes of a vulture, the town sheriff, a man named Peters, who was generally considered more of a suggestion than a law, stood awkwardly by the wall. Samuel Briggs had, of course, a seat at the front. When Hattie entered, the room went silent. The murmur of legal-sounding words died. All eyes turned to the doorway. The survivors filed in, filling the back of the room. They did not speak. They did not have to. They were a portrait, painted in floodwater and mud, of the railroad's progress. "My God," someone whispered. "What is this, Hattie?" Sheriff Peters asked, his hand going to his mustache, his voice weak. "This," Hattie boomed, her voice cracking the silence, "is what happens when you send wolves to guard the sheep." She pointed a muddy finger at the railroad men. "You said it was a survey. You said it was security. It was an ambush. You waited for the flood, and you used it." The agent, Mr. Harris, stood slowly, brushing a piece of lint from his suit. "Mrs. Rose, your capacity for drama is well known. We have just heard, by telegraph, that there was an unfortunate weather event, a natural disaster." "Disaster," Hattie laughed, a terrible, sharp sound. "You call Miles Thorne nature while we were trying to save our children. Your security rode down laughed, and stole our proof. He stole the Coyote Spring boundary marker, the stone that has been there for 100 years. The room erupted. The stone! Stole it! Samuel Briggs stood up, his face a mask of practiced, deep concern. He held up a soft hand for silence. Friends, please. This is a terrible, emotional moment. Mrs. Rose is clearly overwrought. We all are. But we cannot let hysteria guide us. He turned, his cold, pale eyes finding Clara, who stood beside Atsidi. And who, Briggs said, his voice dripping with pity, is her star witness, this unfortunate woman? He let his gaze sweep the room. Miss Clara Mallory, a woman who came to this town under false pretenses. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sheet of paper. This is a letter, a promise of marriage. She came here to be my wife, to secure a dowry from my good name. And when I, in my good judgment, found her unsuitable, she was cast out. And where did she go to him? He pointed at Atsidi. She has been living in sin with this dying warrior. She has shamed this town. She has brought this trouble upon us. And now, this jilted, compromised woman asks you to believe her, to side with her, against the very progress, the very railroad, that will make us all rich. She is a liar. She is an opportunist. And she is, I am sad to say, a woman of no reputation whatsoever. The silence that followed was thick and foul. The townsfolk, who had been on the edge of outrage, now looked confused. They looked at Clara, her muddy dress clinging to her, her wild hair. They looked at Atsidi, his dark, battered, and silent presence beside her. And they looked at Samuel Briggs, in his clean vest, the picture of aggrieved respectability. Clara had faced fire. She had faced a flood. She would not face this. She stepped forward. The mud on her boots made a sucking sound on the clean floor. She was no longer the girl from Nebraska, standing in anyone's shadow. He is right, she said, her voice clear and carrying to the back wall. The room gasped. Hattie's face fell. Briggs smiled. I am a woman of no reputation, Clara continued, her eyes locked on Briggs. Because you stole it, Samuel, just as your partner stole that stone. She reached into the bodice of her own dress, into the one dry place she had left, and pulled out the small, ribbon-tied packet of letters. You say I came to defraud you. She held up the letters. Here is the fraud. She did not read them. She walked to the front and slapped them on the table in front of Sheriff Peters. Look at them. Sheriff, you know Mr. Briggs's signature. It is right there. Now look at the letter itself. Look at the ink. It is a different color. It is a different pen. Look at the handwriting. It is elegant. It is a woman's hand. The hand, she said, her voice rising, of the schoolmarm in the next county. The one he hired to write poetry to me, because he is a man of commerce, not words. Briggs's face went from smug to white to a mottled, furious red. He did not want a wife, Clara said, turning to the crowd, her voice ringing. He wanted my family's name and my father's deed to offer as collateral to his partners. He wanted to buy my honor to secure his deal. This is the man who speaks of reputation. This is the man who partners with the railroad. Before Briggs could find his voice, another man spoke. Jonah Cooper. He stepped forward, his face pale, but his eyes burning. He is not the only liar in this room. He did not look at Briggs. He looked at the back of the room, where a large, smiling man was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, as if watching a mildly amusing play. Miles Thorne. That man, Jonah said, his voice shaking but growing stronger with every word. Mr. Harris, you call him your security. The town calls him a hired gun. I call him a murderer. Thorne's smile did not falter, but his eyes narrowed. I saw him, Jonah said, his voice cracking. "I saw him today, in the wash. He laughed as he stole the marker. He laughed as he tore up Hattie's petition. He laughed as our children nearly drowned." Jonah took a step, and the crowd parted for him. "But this is not the first time I have seen him laugh by a river. He was in Texas 5 years ago. My older brother, Ben, had a claim on the water. Thorn was security then, too, for another company. There was a dispute. My brother was on a rope, in the current, trying to clear a jam. And Thorn, he just smiled. He took out his knife, and he cut the rope." Jonah was sobbing now, but he did not stop. "He cut the rope. He watched my brother drown for water, and you hired him. You brought him here to do it again." Thorn had stopped smiling. His hand, in a blur, went for his gun. "You talk too much, boy." He drew. He was fast, but Sheriff Peters, a weak man pushed too far, had finally found his spine. "Thorn!" Peters yelled, drawing his own gun. "You are under arrest." Thorn did not even look at him. He fired at Jonah. The room was a single, deafening explosion. Jonah dove. The bullet meant for him tore into the wall. At the same instant, Thorn fired a second shot, this one at the sheriff. Peters grunted, a red flower blooming on his chest, and collapsed, his gun skittering across the floor. Screams! The room dissolved into pure panic. People dove under tables. Thorn's 2 men, who had been with him at the back, drew their own guns, providing cover, yelling, "Boss, to the door!" Thorn was laughing, a wild, high-pitched sound, his eyes alive with the violence. He saw Atsidi, who was trying to shove Hattie and Natani's children behind a heavy wooden bench. Atsidi, his one good arm useless for a fight, his body a map of injuries. "You!" Thorn bellowed, his blood up, recognizing the man from the forge, the man from the canyon. He raised his revolver to finish the Indian, to finish the fight. In that one frozen second of distraction, Clara acted. She was not a hero. She was not a fighter. She was a practical woman. She saw a tool. Near the door, a rancher had dropped his coiled lariat, his horse rope. She did not think. She grabbed it. It was heavy, wet, and caked with mud. As Thorn leveled his gun at Atsidi, Clara threw the rope. It was not a graceful, circling lasso. It was a desperate, heavy, tangled throw. The coiled mass of wet hemp flew across the room and hit Thorn's arm, just as he was pulling the trigger. The bullet went wild, smashing into the ceiling. The heavy rope, tangled, fouled his arm, his gun. He roared, not in pain, but in sheer animal rage. Atsidi moved. He could not throw a punch. He could not draw a gun, but he could use his weight. With a guttural yell, he lunged, his entire body, his one good shoulder, hitting Thorn at the knees. Thorn went down. He hit the floor with a crash that shook the building. The impact sent his gun sliding, but he was a bear, roaring, trying to get his knife. But he was down, and the spell was broken. The ranchers, the townsmen, who had been cowering, saw their chance. They piled on, 6, 7 men, landing on Thorn, who was still fighting, still roaring. Someone grabbed the rope and began to tie his hands. The 2 deputies, seeing their boss fall, threw down their guns. It was over. The room was silent, save for the sound of gasping breath and the low, pained groan of Sheriff Peters. Hattie was at his side instantly, ripping a man's shirt, pressing the cloth to the wound. "He is alive!" she yelled. "It is high in the shoulder. He is alive!" The people of Red Butte slowly, fearfully, stood up. They looked at the scene. Samuel Briggs was plastered against the wall, his face the color of old milk. The railroad man, Mr. Harris, was brushing himself off, his face a picture of pure political horror. His security plan had just shot the town sheriff in front of 30 witnesses. And in the middle of the room stood Atsidi Nez, his chest heaving, his face contorted in agony from the effort. Leaning against the bench, and beside him, Clara Mallory, her hands and dress covered in mud, still clutching the muddy end of the rope. The town looked at Briggs, the liar. They looked at Harris, the employer, and they looked at the two people who had, time and again, stood for them. The realization was total and silent. "Mr. Harris raised his hands, his voice slick, already spinning. This is a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. This man, Thorne, was an independent contractor. We had no idea of his history. He was recommended to us. This changes everything." He looked at the hard, muddy, furious faces of the survivors. He looked at the sheriff, bleeding on the floor. "The survey is, of course, postponed," he said quickly. "Indefinitely. This is clearly a matter for a higher authority, a federal marshal. The courts. We will withdraw until this is settled. We are men of law, after all." He and his surveyors gathered their maps, their hats, and they backed out of the room, as if escaping a fire. Clara watched them go. She watched as 4 men, including Jonah, hauled a still-cursing Miles Thorne to the jail cell. They had won. They had stopped him. But the agent's words echoed in her ears. The courts. A federal marshal. They had not given up. They had just retreated to get a bigger, more powerful, and perfectly legal gun. She turned. Her eyes met at Ceedy's. He was watching her. The pain in his expression was real, but it was eclipsed by a fierce, terrible, shared understanding. This was not the end. The battle for the town had been won, but the war for the land, for the water, for Coyote Spring itself, had only just begun. The victory in the town hall was a hollow, brittle thing. Miles Thorne was in a cell, but the cell was in a town whose sheriff was shot, whose power structure was in tatters, and whose most powerful citizens were either liars or employers of murderers. The railroad agent had retreated, but he had retreated to the unassailable fortress of federal law. They had won a moment, not the war. The town spent the night in a state of suspended dread. Hattie Rose and Clara, with the help of the town's few decent women, turned the diner into a makeshift hospital, tending to Sheriff Peters. His wound, as Hattie had seen, was high in the shoulder. He would live, a fact that gave the town its only small comfort. At Ceedy's arm was not so simple. Clara, her hands now practiced, had cleaned and bound the shattered mess of his left arm, but the pain was a visible thing, a pale shadow beneath his skin. He sat in his hogan, his face to the east, breathing through it. He refused laudanum, needing his mind clear. The dread broke with the dawn. It came not as a sound, but as an absence. The deputy who had been guarding Thorne's cell, a new man named Rourke, the one who had been hired on Samuel Briggs' recommendation, was gone. And so was Miles Thorne. The cell door stood open, the lock filed clean. The sheriff's office was empty. The news spread through Red Butte like a stain. Jonah Cooper was the one who found it. He ran from the jail to the smithy, his face ashen. He is gone. Clara at Ceedy. He is gone. A rancher, his face tight with fear, galloped down the main street not 10 minutes later. A party of riders, 10, maybe 12 men. They met him at the county line. Hired guns. Looked like they did not ride east to escape. They are riding west, toward the spring. The town, which had been paralyzed by fear, was now galvanized by a single, terrible understanding. Thorne was not fleeing justice. He was going to finish the job. He was going to take Coyote Spring, not with a surveyor's map, but with blood. He would hold the water by force and dare the coming federal marshal to move him. He was creating a new, ugly fact on the ground. Hattie Rose, her face like a thundercloud, strode from the diner. "Well," she boomed, "he cannot shoot all of us." Hattie, this is not a town meeting, Jonah said, his voice pleading. This is a massacre. He has 12 men. Then we will not give him a fight, a quiet voice said. Atsidi Nez emerged from the hogan. He was in terrible pain. His left arm was in a tight, clean sling Clara had fashioned, but his right hand was steady. He was not dressed for war, he was dressed for work. We are not going to fight, Atsidi said, his voice low, but carrying in the stunned silence. We are going to be witnesses. We are going to bring the law, the real law. He looked at Natani's husband, who had been an elder in training. Go, he said in Dine. Bring the story stone. It is time. We will meet them on the land. The man nodded, his eyes wide, and ran. They gathered. A small, desperate group. Hattie, her face set. Jonah, armed with the sheriff's spare rifle and his own terrible, righteous anger. Clara, her valise no longer holding bandages, but packed with charcoal, paper, and a canteen. And Atsidi, who could not hold a rifle, but who was their center. They were joined by a few of the ranchers, men who had finally, and completely, understood that if the spring was taken, they were the next to be starved out. They rode west. As they rode, the Dine elder met them, his horse sweating. He carried a heavy, flat stone, wrapped in buckskin. It was not a map of lines and squares. It was a carving, an ancient, spiral representation of the land, showing the mountains, the washes, and at the very center, a cluster of marks that meant life, water, beginning. It was their deed, written not by a lawyer, but by God. They arrived at Coyote Spring as the sun was climbing to its midday peak. The land was still wet from the flood, the air clean and cool. The spring itself was a pool of clear, miraculous water, bubbling from the red rock, now surrounded by a new, treacherous-looking marsh of dark silt. Thorn and his men were already there. They were camped on the high ground, the place Hattie had seen him on the day of the flood. They had casks of whiskey, and their laughter was a profane sound in the sacred place. Well, look here, Thorn bellowed. Standing up, he held his rifle in his hand. He had seen them coming. The welcoming party, come for another swim? Have you? His men laughed, a chorus of rough, cruel voices. We are not here to fight you, Thorn! Hattie yelled, her voice straining. We are here as witnesses. This spring belongs to the people, all of us. This spring, Thorn said, patting his rifle, belongs to whoever can hold it, and I am holding it. Atsidi dismounted, his movement stiff. He walked, not toward Thorn, but toward the spring. The elder walked with him, carrying the stone. Halt! Thorn roared, leveling his rifle. One more step. Indian, and you are a dead man. Atsidi stopped. He turned to the elder. He spoke in Dine, his voice quiet, but clear. He was not speaking to Thorn. He was speaking to his people, to the land. They brought the stone to the edge of the water, and they unwrapped it. Atsidi looked at his small group. He wants a fight, he said in English, but he does not get to choose the battle. He looked at Jonah, at Hattie. He thinks his strength is in his men, but it is not. It is in our fear. We will not be afraid. He looked at Clara. We will be smart. He pointed to the new, dark, wet silt that ringed the spring. The flood took, but it gave. That ground is soft. It is quick. A man in boots will sink. A horse will be trapped. He pointed to the high, western rock face, which caught the full blaze of the sun. Clara, your bag. Do you have a mirror? A piece of glass? She did, her small, silver-backed hand mirror. Jonah, you take the high ground. To the north, Clara, you go south. Hattie, you stay with the horses here. When they come, we do not stand. We scatter, and when you are in position, you will make the sun flash. Make him think there are more of us. Make him think we are surrounding him. It was a desperate, thin plan. "What about you?" Clara asked, her voice tight, her heart cold with fear. "I," Atsidi said, "am the bait." He turned, and with his one good hand, he walked toward the spring, toward Thorn. "Thorn!" he called out, his voice a clear, strong challenge. "You are a coward. You fight with fire, and you fight with floods. You do not dare face a man." Thorn's laughter was a bark. "You are not a man. You are a wounded dog, and I am here to put you down." He gestured to his men. "Spread out. They are trying to flank us. Take them all." The mercenaries, with a whoop, spurred their horses down the slope, firing their rifles into the air. "Now," Atsidi roared. Hattie, Jonah, and Clara scattered. The ranchers who were with them, seeing the plan, did the same. The mercenaries, drunk and overconfident, charged straight in. Just as Atsidi had predicted, their horses hit the new silt and stopped, plunging to their chests in the thick, sucking mud. The riders yelled in surprise and terror as their mounts screamed, trapped, fighting the ground. "It is a trick," one of them bellowed, trying to dismount, only to sink to his own waist. At the same moment, from the north, a flash of light, a mirror, glinting. It was Jonah. Then, from the south, another flash. Clara! The trapped mercenaries panicked. "We are surrounded. It is an ambush." Miles Thorn, on the high ground, saw his entire force neutralized in 30 seconds. His men were not fighters. They were bullies. Trapped. They were useless. He roared in rage, his face purple. He did not care about them. His eyes found the man who had done this. "Atsidi." Thorn threw his rifle down and pulled his knife. "This is on you!" he screamed, and he charged, not on his horse, but on foot, his powerful legs carrying him down the slope toward Atsidi, who stood alone by the water. Atsidi did not run. He could not. He simply waited. Clara, from her perch, saw it. "No, Atsidi!" she screamed. Thorn hit Atsidi like a freight train. The two men went down, rolling, not into the deep mud, but onto the hard-packed, sacred earth by the spring itself. It was not a duel. It was a slaughter. Thorn was a bear, full of rage and strength. Atsidi was broken, with one good arm. Thorn was on top, his massive hand on Atsidi's throat, his other hand raising the long, gleaming knife. "This," he spat, "is for my brother in Texas. This is for the boy you saved." Jonah's voice cut the air, but he was too far away. "No," Atsidi choked, his one good hand locked on Thorn's wrist, holding the knife an inch from his chest. "This is for your arrogance." Atsidi was not fighting. He was surviving. He knew he could not win. He was just holding. Thorn's strength was absolute. He pressed. The knife point touched Atsidi's shirt. "Stop!" Clara screamed, and she was running, abandoning her post, her mirror. She was running at the two men, and in her hand, she held the only weapon she had, the heavy iron 10-inch skillet. She brought it down, with all her strength, all her fear, all her rage, on the back of Miles Thorn's head. The sound was a dull, sickening thunk. Thorn's eyes went wide. His grip loosened. He looked, not at Atsidi, but at her, his expression one of pure, animal surprise. He tried to turn, to rise, but his body would not obey. He collapsed, sideways, a dead weight, and lay still. Silence. Atsidi lay on the ground, gasping for air, the knife still locked in his grip, an inch from his own heart. Clara stood over them, shaking so violently she dropped the skillet. Jonah ran up, his rifle ready. He looked at Thorn, who was unconscious, but breathing. He looked at Atsidi. He looked at Clara. And then it began to rain. It was not a flood. It was not a storm. It was a soft, fine, gray mist. A blessing. It landed on Thorn's face, on Atsidi's chest, on Clara's hair, It was a gentle, cooling, cleansing shower. Hattie ran up, her face a mask of awe. "My God," she whispered. Clara's mind, which had gone white with terror, refocused. The stone. "Hattie," she said, her voice shaking. "The paper, the charcoal, now!" While Jonah and the ranchers, their guns now trained on the still-stuck mercenaries, held the peace, and while Atsidi slowly, painfully, got to his feet, Clara and Hattie went to work. They did not need to move the story stone. It was there, its ancient truth shining in the rain. Clara knelt in the mud, by the sacred spring. Hattie held the paper, the last clean sheet she owned, against the stone's carved surface. Clara's hands were black. She rubbed the charcoal over the paper, and as she did, an image appeared, the spiral, the mountains, and at the center, the mark for water, for life. She was not just making a copy. She was translating the land's law into a language the railroad, the courts, the federal marshals, would be forced to understand. Atsidi came to stand beside her. He was covered in mud, his arms screaming, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. The rain fell, soft and steady. It was a baptism, a washing away of the blood and the fear. The small group stood together in the gentle rain by the spring, surrounded by defeated enemies. They were soaked. They were battered. But they were, for the first in a long time, clean. The arrival of the circuit judge, a man named Elias Thorne, was not the grand affair the railroad had hoped for. He did not come with a cavalry escort or a team of slick lawyers. He came in a single, dusty buggy, with a one-eyed U.S. marshal and a reputation for a kind of justice that was as hard and unadorned as the landscape itself. He was a tall, gaunt man with a beard the color of salt and pepper. And he did not like what he saw in Red Butte. He saw a town whose sheriff was in bed, shot with a bullet bought by the railroad. He saw a jail cell that was empty, its lock filed, and he saw a community, half white, half dine. That was a powder keg. "I will not hear this in a room," Judge Thorne declared, his voice a dry rasp. "This is not a dispute over paper. This is a dispute over land. We will go to the land." And so, the next morning, the entire town of Red Butte, or at least its principal players, rode west. The judge, his marshal, and a very nervous-looking railroad agent, Mr. Harris. Hattie rose, her face clean, her dress mended, her eyes like iron. Jonah Cooper, who walked with a new, somber authority. Samuel Briggs, who had been ordered to attend, his brocade vest looking stained and his soft face slick with sweat. And, riding at the back, Clara Mallory and Atsidi Nez. Atsidi's arm was a wreck, bound tightly, his face pale with a pain that was now a permanent part of him. Clara rode beside him, her back straight. In her valise was the charcoal rubbing, and the letters. Miles Thorne was already at the spring, under guard. The U.S. Marshal, a grim, silent man, had ridden out with Jonah at dawn. They had found Thorne's mercenaries still trying to extract their horses from the quicksand, their arrogance long gone, replaced by a whining, muddy misery. Thorne himself was tied to a tree, his head throbbing from Clara's skillet, his fury a low, burning coal. They gathered at the spring. The water bubbled, clear and indifferent. The air was cool after the rain. "I have read the railroad's charter," the judge said, his voice cutting the silence. "It grants them a right-of-way, and land adjacent, Mr. Harris. You claim this spring is part of that land." "That is correct, Your Honor," Harris said, unrolling a large, clean map. "As you can see, our survey, filed legally, marks this as Section 4, Railroad Property." "A very pretty map," Hattie Rose said, stepping forward. "But a map is just a story someone wrote down. I have a different story." She told it, She told of the fire. She told of the flood. She told of watching Thorne's men laugh as they stole the boundary stone and tore her petition. "She is overwrought, Your Honor," Harris interjected, his voice slick, a tragic but emotional outburst. "I am not," a new voice said. Jonah Cooper stepped forward. "I am not overwrought. I am a witness. I was employed by this man. I saw Miles Thorne, their security, commit murder in the state of Texas 5 years ago. I saw him shoot our sheriff, and I saw him, on this very spot, attempt to murder Mr. Atsidi Nez." The marshal, who had been standing impassively, made a small note in a book. "Murder in Texas. We will be extraditing him for that. Judge." Thorne, tied to the tree, just spat. "Testimony," Harris said, sweating now, "from a disgruntled ex-employee, and this," he pointed at Atsidi. "We are expected to believe this native against a legal federal charter." "You will not have to believe him," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped everyone. She stepped forward, mud on her hem, and stood before the judge. She looked so small and so tired and so absolutely, terrifyingly calm. Mr. Harris is a man of paper," she said. "Mr. Briggs, his partner, is also a man of paper." She looked at Samuel Briggs, who seemed to shrink. "Mr. Briggs has accused me of being a woman of no reputation. He is correct. I have none. He has accused me of coming here under false pretenses. He is incorrect. I was the one brought here under false pretenses." She laid the packet of letters on the judge's makeshift table. "Here, Your Honor, is the mail order contract. And here," she laid the letters beside it, "is the fraud, mail fraud. I believe it is called a man using the federal mail to lure a woman across the country, not for marriage, but to defraud her family of their land deed, to use as collateral in his empire." Judge Thorne picked up the letters. He was a practical man. He did not care about the poetry. He looked at the signature on one and the handwriting on the other. He looked at the postmarks. He looked at Samuel Briggs, whose face had collapsed. "Mr. Briggs," the judge said, his voice cold, "you have committed a federal crime. You have also wasted this court's time. You will pay restitution to Miss Mallory's family, to the full value of the dowry you solicited. And if I see your face in this territory again, I will have you jailed for this fraud for 10 years. Get out of my sight." Briggs did not speak. He scrambled away, stumbling in the mud. A man whose empire had dissolved into a single, humiliating document. "Mr." Harris looked shaken, but not defeated. "This is unfortunate, Your Honor, a personal matter. It has no bearing on the railroad's legal claim." "No," Clara said, "it does not, but this does." She unrolled the charcoal rubbing, the paper still damp. She laid it on the table. The spiral, the mountains, the mark for water. Harris laughed, a thin, reedy sound. A drawing, a child's scribble. You are offering native superstition against a federal map." "It is not a drawing," Clara said. She pointed. "It is a map, the same as yours. It is just older." She looked at the judge. "Your map shows a line. This map shows a life. It is the story stone, the original boundary marker." She pointed to the ground, where the elder still stood, guarding the stone itself, which was now washed clean by the rain, its ancient carvings sharp and clear. "The one Mr. Thorne stole is just a copy. That is the true deed. It has been here, as the Dines say, since the time of the grandfathers. It is a prior claim, one that predates the railroad. It predates the United States." Judge Thorne was silent. He walked from the table to the stone. He touched it. He was a hard man, but he was not a fool. He looked at the lines carved in the rock. He looked at the charcoal copy. He looked at the bubbling, clear water. He looked at the railroad agent. "Mr. Harris, this court recognizes two things. First, it recognizes this." He held up the rubbing. "This is a document of prior claim by a people to a fundamental resource, and this court recognizes this." He gestured to the community, the white ranchers, Hattie, the Dine families, all standing together, battered and muddy. "This is a community. You cannot have a community without water. Your map is a fiction. It is a lie. Your claim to this specific parcel, Section 4, is hereby nullified. The land immediately surrounding Coyote Spring is declared protected community property, to be shared by all inhabitants, under federal protection." Harris's face was white. "Judge, the railroad. We will appeal to Washington." "You do that," the judge rasped. "You tell them in Washington that Judge Elias Thorne said you cannot grow a railroad by killing a town. Now get off this land." It was over. The silence that followed was so pure, so absolute. It was like the first breath of a new world. The marshal walked to the tree where Miles Thorne was tied. He untied him, and in the same motion, bound his hands in front of him. "Miles Thorne, you are under arrest for the murder of Ben Cooper in the state of Texas and the attempted murder of Sheriff Peters. You will hang." Thorne did not struggle. He stood up. His head was bandaged. His face was a mask of bruises. He looked, not at the judge, not at the marshal. He looked past them, at the small, bubbling spring. He saw the water. He saw Hattie, Jonah, Clara, and Atsidi, standing together. He saw the one thing he had fought for, burned for, killed for, and he saw that he had never, for 1 second, understood it. He did not see a resource. He saw a thing that had beaten him. He saw a belonging that he could never, ever have. He sneered, but his eyes were dead. He turned and let the marshal lead him away. That afternoon, the town was quiet. The healing had begun. Jonah Cooper found Clara by the smithy, where she was helping Atsidi clean his forge. "I am leaving. Clara," he said, his hat in his hands. "Oh, Jonah," she said, her heart aching for him. "No, it is good," he said, and for the first time, he smiled. A true, clean smile. "The town, they gave me a reward for Ben. I'm going to buy that ranch, the one I told you about. Somewhere the water is just water." He looked at her, his eyes clear. "You are a good woman, Clara Mallory, the best." He had been a boy, but he was a man now. He held out his hand to Atsidi. "Mr. Nez, you are a man of honor." Atsidi took his hand, his good right hand, and gripped it. "You are a witness. Jonah Cooper, you are a man of truth." Jonah nodded. He tipped his hat to Clara, and he walked away. Not a lost love, but a friend. A good man closing a triangle, leaving a straight, clean line. Hattie Rose, meanwhile, was not resting. She was on a ladder, a bucket of paint in her hand. She was painting over the sign of her diner. The open hand was gone. In its place, in big, bold, slightly crooked letters, she painted "The Community House." Underneath, "All welcome." That night, Natani's family ate at the same table as the rancher who had lost his goats. The healing was not just in the land. It was in the people. Clara sat in her hogan, which was no longer a shelter, but a home. The wind was gentle. The sound of the forge was silent, by the light of a single candle. She was writing a letter to her mother. "Dearest mother, you will not believe the things that have happened. I am not married. The man I was to meet was not a good man, but you must not worry. I have not been ruined. I am safe. I have work, with a good woman named Hattie, and I have a home. It is not a big house. It is round, but it is strong. It is the first place I have ever been where I do not feel I am standing behind anyone. I am standing beside, I have found my voice. It is not as pretty as Evelyn's, but it is loud. It is mine. I do not know when I will come home, but I am, for the first time, not afraid. Do not worry for me. Your loving daughter, Clara. She put the pen down. She felt a presence. Atsidi was standing in the doorway. His arm was in a clean sling. He had been to the new doctor who came with the judge. The doctor said the arm would heal, but it would be stiff, scarred. He would never swing the heaviest sledge again. He said nothing, but he was not empty-handed. He had been at his forge, doing work that required not strength, but skill. He held out his good hand. In his palm was a bracelet. It was silver, heavy and old, beaten into a simple, beautiful cuff. It was the silver his grandmother could not spend. He had hammered it, and on its surface, he had etched, with a fine, careful hand, the delicate, repeating pattern of falling rain. He did not ask. He did not speak. He simply held it out. Clara held out her arm, the arm that had thrown the rope, the arm that had held the skillet. He slid the heavy, cool silver onto her wrist. It was a promise, a vow of protection. Outside, in the dark, something moved. In her small garden, in the new black silt left by the flood, a tiny, determined green shoot of corn was pushing its way up toward the sky. The dawn was not a battle. It was a promise. The sky over Coyote Spring was a pale, clear, shell pink. A color of such delicate peace it felt as if the land itself was breathing for the first time. They came, not as two separate groups, but as one. Hattie rose, her face washed clean of soot and fury, now just strong and kind. Jonah Cooper had delayed his departure for this one morning, his new horse saddled, his face turned toward his future, but his heart still here. For this moment, the ranchers, their hats in their hands, the Dine families, Natani and her children, the elder, and Clara and Atsidi. They walked to the spring. The water was clear. The mud had settled. The new, rich, dark earth left by the flood was already promising life. There was no stolen stone. In its place, there was a post, a heavy piece of cedar that Atsidi had carved. His left arm, stiff and scarred, had been a hindrance, but his right hand, his good hand, had been guided by a precision that was more than just skill. It was a prayer. On one side of the post, he had carved the spiral, the ancient mark of the spring. On the other side, in plain, deep English letters, he had carved Coyote Spring, community water, all are welcome. They gathered around it. Judge Thorne, who had also stayed for this, stood forward. He was not in his robes. He was in his traveling clothes, a man of the law, but also, for this moment, just a man. "We are here," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "to mark a new thing, but it is also a very old thing. The law, the real law, is not just about what is written on paper. It is about what is written on the land, and in the hearts of good people. This marker," he gestured to the post, "is that law, a law of sharing?" He put his hand on the post. The elder, Natani's husband, put his hand beside it. Two laws, two hands, one post. "Now," Judge Thorne said, a rare, small smile cracking his gaunt face, "we have another piece of business, a civil union." He looked at Clara and Atsidi. They stepped forward. Clara, in her mended, mud-stained dress, the only one she had left. Atsidi, in his work clothes, on her wrist, the silver rain cuff gleamed. "In the territory of Arizona," the judge said, "by the power vested in me by the United States government, I am permitted to join two people in matrimony. It is not a ceremony of bells and fancy words. It is a contract, a promise. Do you, Clara Mallory, Take this man, Atsidi Nez, to be your lawful, wedded husband." Clara looked, not at the judge, but at Atsidi. She saw his face, the lines of pain that were now part of him, the strength that had never, not once, wavered. She saw the man who had offered her shelter, who had taught her to listen for water, who had cut his own safety line to plunge into a flood for her. "I do," she said. Her voice was not the whisper of a girl. It was the clear, strong statement of a woman. "And do you, Atsidi Nez," the judge said, his voice softer, "take this woman, Clara Mallory, to be your lawful, wedded wife." Atsidi looked at Clara. He saw the woman who had faced down Samuel Briggs, who had pulled a child from a fire, who had smashed a skillet over a murderer's head, and who, most of all, had steadied her hand to bandage his wounds when she herself was shaking with fear. He saw the woman who had answered his question, not with words, but with her life. "I do," he said. His voice was a low, solid vow. "Then," Judge Thorne said, "having made this contract before God and these witnesses, I pronounce you man and wife." He nodded. "That is the law." The elder stepped forward. "Now," he said, his voice gentle, "is the blessing." He did not speak of contracts. He spoke of the earth and the sky, of the male rain and the female, growing land. He spoke of Hozo, the Dine concept of balance, of walking in beauty. He asked that their home be a place of balance, their hands a place of balance, their hearts a place of balance. He sprinkled corn pollen, the yellow, sacred dust of life, onto the ground at their feet. The ceremony was over. There was no music. There was no kiss. Atsidi turned to her, in front of the judge, the ranchers, his own people. He held out his right hand, the calloused, scarred, working hand. Clara looked at it. She raised her own, the hand that had held the skillet, that had thrown the rope, that had written the letter. She placed her hand in his. They stood, their hands clasped. Then, slowly, as if in a prayer, Atsidi raised their joined hands. He did not kiss her. He simply touched his forehead to hers, skin to skin, breath to breath. It was a promise more intimate than any kiss, a silent, shared vow. A child laughed. It was Sanya, the girl Clara had saved from the fire. The sound was so pure, so full of life, it broke the spell. The children, who had been watching, silent and wide-eyed, erupted. They ran, laughing, around the spring, their voices echoing off the red rocks, their small feet chasing each in the new, clean mud. Their laughter was the sound of the future. It was louder than any hammer, louder than any gunshot. Red Butte was not the same town. The railroad, facing a federal inquiry and the loss of its hired muscle, had pulled its survey stakes. The agent, Mr. Harris, was gone. The wound of the town began to heal, but it healed into something new. Samuel Briggs's mercantile did not stay shuttered for long. Hattie Rose, using the reward money the town had collected, bought it at auction. She did not, as she said, have a mind for ladies' bonnets. So she sold it to a quiet Quaker family who had come on the stage. The first sign they put in the window did not advertise new goods from the East. It was a simple, hand-painted sign, "Community well, all are welcome. Mornings, 6 to 9. The small, steepleless chapel, which had been a place of brimstone, became a school. In the mornings, Clara stood at the front. She taught the ranchers' children and the Dine children together. She taught them their letters, how to read, how to write. In the afternoons, Natani took her place, and she taught them the Dine words, the stories, the names of the plants that grew in the wash. The children of Red Butte were learning two languages, the language of paper and the language of the land. Hattie's community house was always full. It was loud, and it smelled of fresh bread and strong coffee. The ranchers ate beside the dinesmiths. The line that had been drawn in the dust, the line of us and them, had been blurred, and in some places erased by fire, by flood, and by a shared, stubborn will to survive. Clara stood by the spring. One evening, weeks later, her garden was not a few struggling beans. It was a thriving patch of corn, squash, and beans. The three sisters, growing together in the rich, dark silt. She knelt by the water, her silver bracelet catching the light. She looked at her reflection. She saw a face, thinner than the one that had left Nebraska, and browned by the sun. Her hair was pulled back, practical, not in the style Evelyn would have worn. She thought of her sister, a world away, a person of soft hands and easy beauty. She was no longer the girl standing in the shadow. She had not, she realized, thought of Evelyn in months. She was not standing behind anyone. She was standing here. The sound of the forge was quiet. Teased was at the anvil, but his work was different. His left arm was stiff, as the doctor had predicted. It would never again have the strength to swing the 10-pound sledge. But his right arm was strong, and his mind was stronger. He was not forging axles. He was teaching. He was showing a young dine boy how to shape the hot iron, how to make a tool, not a weapon. His strength was no longer in his muscle. It was in his hands and in his knowledge. He finished his work and came to her. He stood beside her, his silence as comfortable, as real, as the stone beneath their feet. They watched the sky turn from blue to a deep, heartbreaking rose gold. The children were quiet, their voices a soft murmur. The day was ending. Teased looked at the water. "Strength," he said, his voice so low she almost did not hear it, "is not the roar. It is not the flood or the fire." He was silent for a long time. "It is the person you choose to sit in silence with." Clara turned. She looked at his profile against the red sky. She thought of the journey, the dust, the lies, the fear. She thought of the night of the fire. Her voice, small and trembling. "I am so afraid." She remembered his question, the question that had defined her entire world. "Can you handle me?" She raised her left hand. The silver bracelet, etched with rain, caught the last bloody light of the sun. She touched his good arm. "We handle it," she said, "together." He turned his head. His eyes met hers. He did not touch his forehead to hers. He did not need to. They were already one. They stood side by side, their shadows stretching long. Two small, strong figures in the vast, red evening, their silhouettes merging, inseparable, on the quiet, life-giving water. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please share your city or country in the comments below so we can all connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and giving this video a like. And if you really want to help this story be heard, please hit that hype button to support the channel. Your support means the world.